I really enjoy a good, solid bass trombone. I think I start off every single bass trombone review I do that exact way, but truth be told, I really just cannot get enough. Let's talk about a very cool bass trombone that came through Clearwater Music a while back. How's it going, y'all? It's your host Sam here from the Samuel Plays Brass channel, where this week on the channel, as part of Scholastic Brass Month Part 2, Electric Boogaloo, we are talking about trombones, with the unifying theme being upgrade instruments. Let's say, in this case, you've been playing the school's rinky-dink bass trombone for a couple years, barely making it work, the triggers are super clacky, the slide is terrible, the sound is brittle and harsh. What do then? Enter the Conn 112H, dual-rotor independent bass trombone. That was a mouthful, so let's back it up and tackle one thing at a time here. Firstly, that model number, 112H. These 100 series instruments are a relatively new addition by Conn, not last year type of recent, but considering Conn's history stretches over a century by now, it's relatively new within the company's time frame. So these are new-ish instruments, and the 112H is one of Conn's newer bass trombones that they tout as professional tier. It's not as highly regarded in Conn loyalist circles as, for instance, the Conn 62H bass trombone, which just got a Gen 2 revamp, so it's very popular. But the 112 is nonetheless a professional instrument. It does garner a reputation as a result of not being as highly reputed as the 62H, of being a little bit more of a school instrument. And in fact, this 112H in this video does belong to a school. It belongs to a local university. Sadly, not the one I go to, although I'd love to play this thing on the regular. I mentioned the 112 was an independent bass trombone, meaning the two rotors can be operated independently of one another. This is usually evidenced by them being found next to each other on the gooseneck of the instrument. The 112's rotors are supposedly Gen 2 rotors, which are supposed to be a little bit less restrictive than their Gen 1 counterparts, and each of them leads to an open wrap tuning slide, which is supposed to induce less turbulence into the sound than older closed wrap trigger slides. Speaking of tuning slides, the main tuning slide on the 112H has a reverse design for supposedly a more conical bore profile and slightly less turbulence, and the bell of the instrument is made from rose brass, which has a little bit more copper content than typical brass. Most brass will have 70% copper, whereas rose brass will have more like 85%, which is supposed to warm up the sound a little bit. And the hand slide of the 112H is a couple of things. First of all, it's relatively lightweight, which is great for smaller hands, and it's also a little bit narrower in construction than some Bach or King bass trombone slides, which is again helpful for people who are slighter of frame, such as yours truly. For you particularly nerdy audience members, let's discuss numbers with some technical specifications. The Conn 112H has a standard 0.562-inch bore. This is very much standard for all modern bass trombones that I can think of, but what's cool is, rather than a fairly common 9 or 9.5-inch bell flare, this bell flare is actually 10 inches in diameter, a little bit larger, and its bell throat, which is the part that leads up to the flare, is correspondingly large. It's one of Conn's larger bell throats. Now, the 112 might feel a little bit different to play than some other bass trombones. First of all, it has what I've dubbed the Conn oddity. A lot of Conn trombones have a patently sharp F partial, just F in the staff. We're taught that B flats and Fs are played in first position, but on some Conn trombones, such as this one, your F in the staff is not really first position at all, but a quarter position farther out, position 1.25, if you will. And E, just below that, is sort of 2.25, and E flat, 3.25, and so on. Specifically E flat, since we're taught third position for that, can get a little bit weird. The bell flare of the 112 is actually about an inch closer to you than on some other bass trombones, and while we typically use the bell flare as a benchmark for third position, we cannot do that on the 112. First of all, E flat is a little bit farther out than you expect, and the bell flare is a little bit closer than you expect, so your third position E flat ends up being well past the bell. Now I mentioned the 112 has two valves, an F valve and a G flat valve, and these two valves respond fairly evenly, which is a lot more than can be said for a lot of even professional quality bass trombones that might like the F side but the response on the G flat is screwy, or some actually prefer the shorter G flat slide and get a little bit stuffy or woofy sounding on the F slide. The 112 is fairly even across both rotors. Both respond nicely, but not exceptionally well, I would say. If you want exceptionally good rotors, you're going to tend to not go for the traditional circular rotors. You might choose one of the many other options on the market today, such as axial flow or Thayer valves. However, I would say that the 112's Gen 2 circular rotors respond fairly nicely with good centered intonation and a nice solid sound. I found the pedal region on the 112 not to be as barky or as loud as on some other bass trombones. Instead of, it's a little bit more of a diffuse and flared out sort of sound, but I found that the instrument had a very solid core in the middle and upper register. Now I alluded to this in the previous clip, but I found the 112H to have a darker and woofier sound than I expected. A lot of bass trombones can sound dark if you approach them quietly, softly, but if you really push them, they brighten up and harshen considerably. For instance, Gonzaga University's Bach 50B3 that I play on, that thing really lights up at fortissimo, whereas the 112H doesn't quite do that to the same extent. You definitely can brighten the tone if you step on it, but it takes a substantial effort in comparison to the Bach. This is probably relatively mouthpiece dependent. The only mouthpiece that I was able to test on this instrument was just a basic Conn 112H, which is not the best mouthpiece for bass trombone in my opinion. I think once you've played bass trombone for a while, you should look into other typically slightly larger sizes. But before I get too off topic, it definitely does seem like that 10-inch rose brass flare kind of diffuses the sound a little bit more than something like a typical 9.5-inch yellow brass flare. Yellow brass has a more punchy sound as is, and a smaller bell concentrates the directionality of the sound, whereas a larger bell flare kind of spreads it through the hall in a more laissez-faire sort of fashion, and that is what we see happening on the Conn 112H. I think the 112H is certainly a great school horn at any level of schooling, and that is the reason I'm giving it a fairly sizable SAM seal of approval, but I also don't think it's fair to pinhole it to that extent the way some people do. I think the 112 holds up pretty decently as a professional caliber bass trombone. It's definitely an upgrade from just about anything with a dependent valve system, because the independent system does offer you a little bit more dexterity and alternate positioning for faster passages. Sorry, dependent loyalists. I know you're out there, I hear you, I sympathize with you, but that's my rationale for most, typical high school, college players. I also think the 112 is a huge upgrade from almost any older bass trombone, besides maybe a Conn 62H. Those older Conns are really something special. But the thing is, bass trombones have undergone a lot of development, even in just the last 50 years, which can't be said to nearly the same extent about trumpets or even tenor trombones. Those have remained a little bit more static over the last half a century than bass trombones. So with bass trombones, it's a little bit more important to try and play on a new instrument if possible. For better or for worse, the 112H is a slightly darker sounding bass trombone that is desirable in a lot of settings, so if the work that you do desires a darker sound, then the 112 will make a really exemplary choice. This makes it stronger in my opinion for the orchestra and especially chamber work than something like the wind ensemble or the jazz band where you're called to really punch through the ensemble with your low notes. I find it a little bit hard to do on the 112H, but everybody reports different findings. For instance, Aiden Ritchie, if you want to check out his channel, he says that the 112 lights up fairly well in his hands. Overall, regardless of where you stick it or what you do with it, I consider the Conn 112H bass trombone to be a very serious, solid instrument, and a great one to consider adding to your arsenal if you're in the market for a bass, especially if you can find one lightly used, because it'll hold on to its value and have a lot of life left in it. I know it hasn't got the greatest reputation because it has to compete with its big brother, the 62H, but this is a professional quality instrument, and as long as you know how to amplify its strengths and are aware of and can work with its weaknesses, I don't see why the 112H would necessarily limit you anywhere. I am not a bass trombonist, I am fairly mediocre at the bass trombone, so all I can give you are my limited experiences, but this is a great instrument overall. If you want to see more instrument reviews, you can find the playlist in the top right corner in the card, and until next time on Scholastic Brass Month, we will see you on the flip side. Thanks for watching, everybody. If you want to support the creation of bigger and better content on the Samuel Plays Brass channel, have your name featured right here, and a whole host of other perks and benefits, then please consider pledging your support at patreon.com/SamuelPlaysBrass. For now, you can find more videos in the end screen cards to my left.